Welcome to Cognisations, a podcast where we interview cognitive scientists about their work and how it applies to our everyday lives. Cognitive science is the interdisciplinary study of the mind, which brings together cognitive psychology, the neurosciences, linguistics, philosophy, modeling, and more. Without further ado, let's jump into today's episode. Hello and welcome to Cognisations. With today's hosts, I'm Jay.
And I'm Tanay.
Language is oftentimes viewed as a paradigmatically human capacity. Indeed, we have observed no other creature who exhibits linguistic abilities with the same complexity and freedom as our own. Conversely, humans are often viewed as vitally linguistic. Our diverse societies and communities seem to be knit together by the thread of spoken, signed, and written words. We tell stories, pass down documents, express our joys and grievances, all by articulating our thought into sequences of sounds, markings, or gestures. It is therefore not surprising that the first words of a child tend to be celebrated. But what goes into the utterance of a first word? How does this develop into fully-fledged linguistic communication? What role does the speech that can be heard in the child's social environment play here? How and why do we speak to children? How does all this vary from one culture to the next? Today's guests are the people to answer these questions, or at least some of them.
And we say guests plural, as this is our first episode with two guests on the show. So they are Camilla Scarf and Alejandrina Cristia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
But you can call me Alex.
Sure. So Camilla Scarf is a postdoctoral researcher in the Human Ecology Group at the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine at the University of Zurich. She's simultaneously doing postdoctoral work in the Language Acquisition Across Cultures group at the Laboratoire des Sciences Cognitives et Psycholinguistiques at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, where she also did her PhD on the influence of socioeconomic and ecological factors on language acquisition under the supervision of her second guest, Alex. Alex is a CNRS research director at the Laboratoire des Sciences Cognitives et Psycholinguistiques. Her work is highly integrative and ambitiously bringing together different methods in order to pinpoint the processes by which we speak and understand language. For this work, she won the CNRS Bronze Medal and the John McDonnell Scholar Award in Understanding Human Cognition. She received her MA and PhD in Linguistics at the University of Purdue. So welcome and thank you both for being on the show.
Thank you. We're delighted. Thank you.
So just to start off, and for listeners, could you describe your academic journey up until now and how you got interested in cognitive science? Maybe we can start with you, Alex.
Sure. I started engineering many years ago, 1998. People wore different clothes back then. And I did a year and a half that dropped out. I thought, what's the most different thing I can do from engineering? So I went into literature, where I quickly realized that reading books is more fun than actually discussing them. So I swung back the pendulum and landed on linguistics. But you can't really study linguistics in Rosario, where I grew up in Argentina. So long story short, I ended up applying for and getting funding to do a PhD in the States. I didn't know it, but I was already doing cognitive science. I thought I was doing linguistics, interdisciplinary linguistics, but in fact, I was already a cognitive scientist. And later I came to the LSCP, that's the lab whose long name you managed to pronounce twice. I did a postdoc there, and then another one in the Netherlands in the neural basis of language. And then I came back as a researcher. So that's in a nutshell how it went.
And how are you, Camilla?
Thank you. I came to cognitive science. I always liked the mind and the study of the mind since I was a young child. But I thought the best way of getting into it was to study medicine. And I wanted to go to the route to neurodegenerative disease to understand the mind. So more of the medical kind of paradigm about it. So I started studying medicine here in France. And then I didn't get in, and I changed to biology. So I went then to biology, the general tract back in the time. Now it's highly specialized. But I always was very interested in the mind and cognitive functions of humans specifically. And I had a few classes that kind of reassured me about that path. Then I got into my first master's that was on integrative biology, which basically was a neuroscience master's here in Paris too. And then I changed to my other master at the Cogmaster at the École Normale Supérieure, where I met Alex for the first time. And I started studying language and language acquisition. And it became really clear to me that the more integrative neuroscience aspect of how neurons work was very far from the more embodied experience of cognition that I was looking for, that I was always interested. And then cognitive science is more kind of that more holistic aspect of studying these phenomena that are very human, I want to say. Some of them, some not, but...
So are there any specific reasons which you studied language versus some other cognitive function?
I want to say that at the beginning it was kind of opportunistic in the sense that Alex was offering an internship, and I felt like it was a really interesting question. I was really at the beginning very interested in cognition in general, so about memory, about executive functions, about attention, perception in general. And then when I kind of saw this opportunity with language, and I was like, yes, of course, I'm myself a bilingual, and the role of language and how it might shape our life and our understanding of things and our culture, our identity is such a multifaceted aspect. It's fun that you don't really think about it because it's so normal until you do, and you're like, oh my God, this is everywhere. And then you cannot unsee it. And ever since I saw it, I cannot unsee it.
Yeah. I think I would like to add that in the Master in particular, in cognitive science in general, there's like two kinds of cognitive scientists: the people who are into language and the people who hate language. I don't know where you are. You invited us here, so I'm guessing you're in the first camp. And I think when you work in development, that's a fraught question. Development happens in an integrated fashion. And you cannot be an infant scientist or a child development scientist if you don't take into account memory, executive function. All of that is in there. So you're not protected from having to pay attention to what happens in other fields.
Why do some cognitive scientists hate language?
I don't know. You have to ask them. I don't get it.
Oh, it's more like a sociological fact than a real scientific one.
I've asked people, and they said, "Oh, but linguists are so boring," and I'm like, "Thank you."
God.
Yeah, but they say no. The thing is that they give these talks and they use all this jargon, and okay, maybe there's something to that. Maybe linguists know about the words and they don't want to use the word memory to describe short-term memory, long-term memory. They don't want to use like a natural language word to describe 17 different concepts. So then this turns talks into a sequence of impossible to parse sentences, unfortunately.
So at least our job today in this episode would be to convince our listeners to join the first camp rather than the second camp. So on that note, you mentioned on your webpage, why are human languages the way they are? So how does one go about answering this question?
I think this is the question neither of us wanted to answer.
Yeah.
With a lot of effort and with a lot of humility, because we are not getting closer to really understanding this. And let me give you an example from like really cutting edge research that I'm not participating in. But there's a new language that's emerging right now that's called pro-tactile. And so this is a language that's being used more and more in the deaf-blind community. So these are people who can neither see nor hear. So in your beautiful introduction, you mentioned sign. So this is a signed language too, but it's not a visual language. It actually travels through a tactile mean. And when you see it, for us, we can see it, right? When you see it happening, it's amazing because you see that these people are actually having multiple channels of communication at the same time. So in a typical discussion, if the two of us are talking to each other in this language, and you are producing language, I will hold one of my hands over your hand so I can feel the signs you're making, and I will hold my other hand on your shoulder or your leg, and I will tap you to indicate if what are my reactions to what you're saying. And so when we think about, why are human languages the way they are, we have these hypotheses that first come from speech, because a lot of linguistics started was on speech. Then we started studying sign languages in the 1960s, 1970s. It took a while for people to understand these are real languages. And now we have this other new type of language that's neither visual nor auditory. And so many of the hypotheses we have as to, speed of processing, neural bases, I think all of that could come into question. So very, very slowly, with a lot of humility, for sure.
Right.
Why is this language just emerging now? Is it because there's an emerging community of people who are both blind and deaf?
You got it. And there's enough of them and they can connect with each other. Because exactly what happened with why weren't sign languages more popular? In fact, there were sign languages in France for 200 years, right? Because there was a school for the deaf here, which there wasn't in the States. They were separated, segregated. So this is one of the things that's happening with positive aspects of globalization, people becoming connected.
It also tells you something about language, that language doesn't happen in a vacuum. It happens, you need at least another person, and in reality, you need a community really to generalize. So when we see this beginning of emerging languages, you need more than one people and often a community, and then probably generation to pass on these languages to see the emergence of what we would call a proper new language.
And I was curious, is this a language that's invented by someone who themselves had auditory and visual deficits?
Yeah. My understanding is that it emerged from one person who was like that and their interpreter who both sees and hears.
Okay.
And so, but there was indeed one person who said, there are some things I don't understand. There are some things that don't travel well. Or even the fact that you have this we call it back channel when you indicate how you're following. So if you go in spoken language, but in protactile, you will tap on their legs or something. This was something that she asked for because she couldn't see and she couldn't hear. So she felt like she was talking into the emptiness, she couldn't get this feedback.
So I guess the question is so hard to answer because language is just very complex and has many different levels. And so I guess one way to start to give an idea of how complex it is to go through this classification that we have in linguistics between the different levels of language. So can you...
The jargon that they don't like.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and so it's your job to convince our listeners now.
So there's morphology, syntax, semantics, phonetics, phonology. So can you break down what all of these things are, please?
Yeah. So I think a simpler way of trying to understand this is to see it from a zoom in to out, maybe, because it's about the units of language and how they arrange maybe together during this process. So you would start with the lexicon, for instance. So the lexicon would be kind of the mental dictionary, the vocabulary that you would handle. Then the study of that word that would be lexicon would be morphology, how words are built, I want to say. Then you have morphosyntaxis, that will be study of syntax with morphology. in which you would understand the structure of larger units. In this case, it would be of a sentence, right? And utterance.
And morphology is for smaller units.
Morphology would be more, correct me if I'm wrong, at the word level unit.
Okay.
So, for instance, if you have suffixes and affixes and how they would change the meaning of a word, that would be...
Right.
Can we have an example, please?
Yes. Represented, underrepresented. So you have an under the affix. Yes. I myself mix sometimes, so the affix under would come to change. But even maybe that wasn't a good example.
It's a perfect example. You even have two, because you have under and it at the end. Represented,
right? That ed also marks a suffix that will give meaning to the word. Then you have, and then talking about the meaning of words, that's semantics, right? And how the meaning of word changes as a function of context, right?
Pragmatics.
And yes, and then you have like in an outer or more holistic level, then there would be the pragmatics, would be these the understanding of the flow of the conversation, of the fact that you are everyone here that you cannot see, but everyone is nodding while I'm saying this, in which you're understanding.
So we're back to channeling.
Yes. There is I'm leaving out phonology for Alex because this is her baby. More than mine. But, and all these different units, what is very interesting to understand them from the point of view of development, infant development, is that they have different timelines.
Okay.
Yeah. It's interesting. So I think to a certain extent, these levels also come from the languages we've studied in the past. And so the levels that haven't been mentioned yet are the phonology, phonetics. So this is like the sound system. But in general terms, this is a very fine-grained division. But in fact, there are people who simplify this a lot, because if you look, for instance, at visual sign language. So now we know we have tactile sign language, the visual sign languages. Very often signs can be can have a lot of meaning in their shape. So they can represent what they're signifying. Whereas in spoken languages, you have onomatopoeias. So I can arguably say that a pig goes oink oink. Maybe. But
so wait, that's an onomatopoeia. Could you just quickly say what an onomatopoeia is?
Yeah. So when a word sounds like what it means. But that's I give an example of a pig goes oink oink.
Right.
You speak other languages. How do pigs go in your other languages? What do they do?
That's a good question. I am not actually aware because, well, at least the language that I've tended to speak back home is a mix between Hindi and English.
Okay.
And so we often borrow a lot of words from English. So even if I had to say it in my mother tongue, I would say a pig in Hindi goes oink oink.
Okay.
Something like that. So yeah, I do not have a good answer for it.
Well, I know Camila also speaks Spanish. So how does a pig go in Spanish?
Oink oink.
Oh, that's very similar. Okay, so how does that didn't work? Let's change the example. How does a dog go? Woof, woof. For you, it goes woof, woof?
Yeah, how does it for you?
Wow, wow.
Oh, wow, interesting. In Hindi, it's like...
Well, I was raised bilingual.
Oh, yeah, I think this is one of these...
this is one of these things.
Yeah, she has some pockets of... We have lexical and morphosyntactic phenomena that are unique to her context.
So that is onomatopoeia.
That one is an example.
Okay.
Yes.
And so you were talking about
phonology.
So this division into different levels, it's like oh, you have phonology, and that is separate from semantics. So the sound is different from the meaning, or the shape is different from. That's very spoken language idea. The division between morphology and syntax. There are languages that basically don't have any syntax. So you can in Russian, for instance, you can put the words any place you want. And in fact,
Oh, really?
yeah, I mean, you can convey different things. Why you move a word, you put a word where you want.
Okay.
But very often languages that have a complex morphology, where you have lots of these little bits of words like represented, but you have things like that for other words that indicate its function. So examples are Greek and Latin, common examples, but Russian is also the case.
Right.
Since you have the function in the word, then you can put the word where you want. And so the division between morphology and syntax, that also reflects a bias that we have from the languages that we started studying. Yeah.
So earlier on, Camilla mentioned that phonology is kind of your baby. And so why out of all aspects of language are you interested in phonology? And does it have any kind of privileged position in the study of human language?
Do you want the real answer?
Yeah, sure.
Politically correct.
We try to keep it real here.
Okay. Well, the real thing, and I have never told this to anyone, is that I like phonology because you can study it from the outside. I don't have intuitions. So many linguists have intuitions. They look at a sentence and they go like, is that sentence ungrammatical? And there's something inside them that lights up. And I don't get that, you know?
Okay.
So I like a thing I can study from the outside. I can measure it. I can, do like phonetic analysis and look at the acoustic wave, or I can look at the video of someone signing. I can look at it from the outside.
Without putting in any intuitions.
Exactly. Which makes me a bit like someone who's an ethologist. It's like I study language as if it was from another species.
Right. So you're really interested in the description of language rather than ascribing interpretations.
Yeah.
So is that fair to say?
Yeah, from the inside. But it doesn't mean that it's better. I'm just very happy there are people who actually do have that intuition, because, I would not be able to do their job.
Fair.
Yeah, I kind of get the same thing as someone who's raised bilingual too, or kind of a heritage speaker of English, meaning that the environment in which I grew up mostly wasn't an English-speaking environment. I have no intuitions about neither English nor French. And having done lots of semantics, when this work that relies on lots of intuition has just meant nothing to me. And I'm guessing it's maybe the same for you, Camilla, as you were saying.
My native language would be kind of French, I guess, but doesn't really exist, right?
Okay.
It would be the mix of French and Spanish. And I have come to realize that more often than not, I'm wrong in what is the consensus of what I speak. So I'm like, yeah, probably what I'm saying is false, not correct, or mispronounced. And I just live with it. The majority of the world speaks more than one language. So I try to put myself in the shoes as like, we are the majority. It's fine. It doesn't speak bad of you if you make mistakes. Actually, there's a lot of psycholinguistic studies, sociolinguistic studies too, that try to show how when you do have an accented speech, people tend to be nicer to accept your mistakes. It's like, okay, you might not have the same experience as me with this language, and people can, not always, but can be more tolerant in pointing out they will not point out mistakes that you're pointing out. That's not how it's pronounced. Some people are like that, but the majority of people are kind of lower their guards when it comes to an accented speaker and be like, okay, fine, I still get you.
Right. So you mentioned psycholinguistics. What is psycholinguistics, and why is it important to study language from a psychological point of view?
I think it's a trick question. Okay, so psycholinguistics, from my understanding of being in it, a little bit what Alex said at the beginning about how she got into cognitive sciences. So basically it's a mix of the study of psychology and linguistics, right? Within the name, you kind of have a little bit of both. But it's not the whole of psychology. It's really cognitive psychology that would do psycholinguistics, right?
Okay.
So, and in the study of cognitive psychology, we are interested in the study of processes, of mental representations,
Right.
how the mind works, how the brain works, and how it maps into some kind of organic substrate that is within our brain, right? And then you have linguistic theory, which allows us to study language in according to a set of rules and regularities that we see in language, and the mix of them gives you psycholinguistics.
And you mentioned mental representations, and even if we can study phonology from the outside, we still postulate some internal things. And so the bread and butter of phonology, in some cases, seems to be phonological representations. What are these?
Good question. Excellent question, in fact. Yeah, I don't really know. And the other thing I mentioned protactile. Another way in which we've been thrown off by questions like this one is more recently by the rise of AI, and everyone knows ChatGPT and large language models. There's also large spoken models. And so then the question of what are mental representations for language or for phonology is raised again. In the past, I thought, when I was young and I was studying at the beginning, I thought, okay, we're going to look into people's brains and we're going to find a section in the brain that responds to P differently from B. And I thought that was, the mental representation I thought is a neural representation. Now I realize that the answer is more complex, because you can have things like machines that don't have a human brain, but have a distinction between P and B.
But they still have representations nonetheless.
Exactly.
It's just not on a biological substrate like the brain.
Exactly.
But also you have weird things in which psycholinguistic experiments also tell something about. So in many languages, the distinction between R and L, for instance, that in French and Spanish and English, we would hear it, right? In some other languages, like Japanese, they would hear it in the same way, right? They would not hear a distinction between those two sounds. Whereas other people who have learned other languages would have and encode those differences. So in psycholinguistic experiments, basically, you can ask these questions and say, okay, if you speak another language, do you perceive the same thing that I'm perceiving? Is the word sound, in this case for spoken language, right? Does the word sound the same to you than to me? And psycholinguistic experiments allow us to answer these questions and realize that some cases yes, some cases no.
Yeah, and I like that that the rise of AI has helped us realize how distributed some of this knowledge can be. We kind of suspected that in, for instance, semantics. We know that there are sections of the brain that responds preferentially to faces and to tools, because someone who's older and has part of their brain affected might actually selectively have problems finding the word for tools, but be fine with remembering 17,000 makes of cars. So we suspected that there was some specificity, but we also know that that person, even though they have a hard time remembering those tools, they can still find some of them. So we knew that knowledge was distributed. But now with machines, it's very clear they can have very different ways of representing this. And there is also a branch of developmental psycholinguistics that's actually trying to create psycholinguistic tests to check the representations that machines have for spoken language, phonology, lexicon, morphosyntax, because now the listeners know exactly what I mean when I say those words.
Yeah. So
we'll test you after.
We'll put up a quiz on the site. So how are these studies specifically developmental psychology studies, if they concern AI and how AI can acquire language, if I understand you correctly? But I guess we could step back, and before answering that, say why it's important to study language acquisition and what role developmental psychology plays in general in the study of language?
I got asked that question for my PhD committee, get my grant, by a board of biologists. Why is it important to study language acquisition? Why questions are always tricky, aren't they? But I can speak about what I feel and what I see is that we have one of the most complex things that we use every day unraveling right in front of us that almost everyone has gone through, and yet we don't really know how it happens. And it's so important for our lives and the societies that we have built and our identities, and yet we don't really know how it works. And it explains so much about us, and we know so little about how language unfolds. And it happens also so fast from a baby who's just born, imagine a baby who's just born, is there, useless, crying, if anything. And then,
It's you've been across babies recently.
I'm sick because of it.
I see.
Probably. And 3 years later, you see again this beautiful little human now, and it knows how to speak or sign, and more often than not. And it's amazing that in such a fast, rapid way we can do that, and we all did it, right? And that's the kind of thing, and it's the kind of the curse, right? If it was easy and just there, we all would remember, right?
Right.
Because it's not the same how you learn your native language, and when later you want to learn another language, or you have to learn another language, right? We don't remember how that happens. You just have it.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I often talk about in talks is Turing, Alan Turing, famous forefather of cognitive science. He said, how do you build a truly intelligent machine, in one of his papers? And he said, well, we could try to do something really difficult like chess. But let's start with something easy, the way a child learns a language. I was like, Turing, you got many things right, but that one, you got right.
But since you mentioned that this is a thing that all of us have done and keep doing at different stages of our life, depending on what circumstances we find ourselves in, how are language acquisition studies done? Are they done in the lab, or are they done in the wild? Because this seems like a thing that's happening out there in the world. So how do cognitive scientists study this process?
You want to take the beginning?
Yeah, sure. I think we learn a lot from lab studies, and that's one of the things that psychology brought to cognitive science. These experimental methods where you take someone, you isolate them. So, for instance, we've done both of us experiments in labs where you have a soundproof room.
Right.
You put a child sits on their parents' lap, and they look at a camera, and there's a video that's played for them, and you measure the child's behavior. For instance, you might show a picture of a doggy next to a picture of a ball, and then you say, look at the ball. And you check whether they indeed look at the ball, and they look at the dog. And so these experiments have been very useful. You can do that kind of experiment. We call them perception experiments. And those have been really game changers, because for many, many years, people thought that babies started learning language when they started producing language. And now we know that they don't. Basically, they're born with lots of skills, and they go on to develop some of them later on before they start producing language. But you can also do production experiments where you, for instance, a famous one that we've done as well is you just ask the listener to repeat a word that you've made up. And so I'm going to test you now and your listeners. I'm going to start with an easy one. Can you please repeat the word woog?
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 Okay, very good. You both pass. Can you please repeat the word tupiro?
Stupro.
Tuperal?
No, that's pretty good. That's good enough. So you notice it was harder to repeat the second one than the first one. There's a kind of little trick to see,
Right.
what can you encode correctly
Mm.
that tells us again about the representations that people have.
Right. Way cool. But since we have also been alluding in earlier parts of the episode that there are so many things about language that we didn't know just because we were emphasizing on spoken language, is there a similar case to be made for language acquisition in some cases? And like, has this research, I mean, these lab methods that you describe sound very cool. But then there are also so many languages out there. So has this research sort of been collaborative to sort of solve the big puzzle of, let's say, language and language acquisition?
Yeah, for sure. Do you want to talk a little bit about how we're taking like lab methods outside of the lab?
Right. So for the listeners, I think I want you to imagine what it takes to when they imagine a lab. Where do they imagine it? Probably they imagine it in a city, probably nearby a hospital or maybe a university. So you have to think that everyone who has participated, or the majority, I want to say, the majority of people who have ever participated in these psycholinguistic tests for language acquisition or language in general, come from people who can take a bus, take a metro, drive to these places. And this is a very narrow subset of the world population and the population that has ever existed around us forever. So one of the ways that in our lab here in Paris that we have kind of worked on is ways in which we can move the lab out to people, to other people, to people who speak other languages, to people who have different socioeconomic backgrounds, for people who live in completely different ways that we might be used to, and then ask the same questions and see if maybe the results are different or the perceptions are different or something about the experiment cannot be done at all and why. What all those questions, what does it tell us about what we think we know from these other people who in general tend to be very homogenous, very similar to each other, that have contributed. And yet we have learned so much, right? We have learned so much from this. And it's like now it's with portability, with technology, with mobility, with phones, I want to say, technology has changed so much and now has allowed for a more diverse way of studying this than ever before. And it's only going to go that way, I have the impression.
I think that when we were talking about bilingualism earlier, and that's definitely one domain in which we've seen a lot of change. So the standard idea was what's normal is being monolingual, and then bilinguals are this deviation from the normality.
Interesting.
And so that was like the way that this was seen. Eventually, it became quite obvious that the majority of children growing up today are learning multiple languages. And so to begin with, the human brain was not created to be monolingual. It's not like we are by default monolingual. We actually are made to learn multiple languages.
Right.
And so, for instance, the timeline of acquisition or development of different things has been shifted quite a bit. There were many questions asked, for instance, about whether children who are exposed to multiple languages are at a disadvantage. So there were these ideas whereby bilinguals had smaller vocabularies than monolinguals. That basically was proven to be wrong, because what was happening was that you were testing a bilingual on just one of their two languages, testing them on both, and you took into account the fact that some of these some of these concepts had two forms, one in each language. And then basically they had similar vocabulary sizes. But really, it's like the fallout of these changes hasn't stopped, and there are so many things, including in simple things like phonology, that have been brought into question. For instance, to give you an example, one very common hypothesis is that we're born being able to hear every distinction that's ever used in any language.
Okay.
And as time goes by 1 year of age, we have figured out which are the distinctions, the sound contrast, like RNL that was mentioned before, that are relevant in our language. And then we forget all of the others. Bilinguals don't work that way at all. So that's not the timeline. That's not how it works. And so if before we thought, you needed to become specialized to language, otherwise it's a disadvantage. We had like a functional explanation for why it happened this way. Now we're asking ourselves questions like, what's wrong with monolinguals? Why are they? So, it's really shifting. It feels, you were asking earlier, what's it like to study this question? And it's like quicksand. Like you take a step and you just dig a little bit deeper.
Right. Well, I'm sort of curious because you earlier mentioned that it was sort of presupposed that monolingualism was normal. Was this prescription of normality theory-driven, or was it more of a social thing that just transpired?
I think you're right. It was more a social thing, and I think it wasn't really conscious.
Yes. I think that this is... I mean, my intuition about this is like an historical aspect. There's an historical aspect to it that can be explained largely by the way that language has been studied, spoken language specifically has been studied, in which you bring these people that can go to these labs where research can be done and is funded in general. And this kind of, in its majority, was in the US or in Western Europe for the longest, and where the tradition for many people was to be monolingual. So.
And the ones that weren't in the States, the ones that weren't often were immigrants.
Yes.
And so, this is a completely different life story. And so something that was interesting that happened was that there was a lab in Barcelona that was established many years ago by a pioneer, and by a team of pioneers, I should say, Lara Bosch and Nuria Sebastián Galles, among other people. And they, what was interesting is that they kept studying bilinguals, and they got completely different results in Barcelona compared to the States. And of course, they were in Europe. The Americans must know better, right? We must be doing something wrong. Of course, if we're not getting the same results. But eventually they realized, in Barcelona, bilinguals are higher SES people. They're people with more means, on average. The people who are monolingual tend to be more rural, tend to be less educated.
Oh, wow, interesting.
Yes. And so are we studying bilingualism differences because of the prestige the two languages have in the two places? Or are we studying socioeconomic differences?
And of course, parents and other people who take care of children play a very important role in the acquisition of language. Can you say something about what this role is? How important are parents and other caretakers in teaching language?
I think that's such a beautiful question, and we get asked that a lot. We talked about how everyone who's listening to this successfully acquired language. That's how they can profit from this. But it does happen sometimes that we feel that kids are not progressing as fast as one we want. And sometimes there's biological reasons for that. Maybe there is a diagnosis of communicative disorder or some larger disorder. And sometimes we don't really know. We have a feeling that the child has normal intelligence, they have normal sensory capacities, and something's not going well. And so there's a lot of interest in trying to see whether the child's experiences can explain some variation in the timeline of acquisition in ways that could be harnessed for possible interventions. I know that this is something that you've thought a lot about. So do you want to, fill in a little bit on, and what do we know about this?
We definitely know that language, as we said before, cannot be learned in a vacuum. So you need like a critical mass, supposedly, of input, right? That it needs to be heard by the baby until unknown, but from a given time, and then kind of shake it, and then Please, please.
Wow,
But
that's
right.
the recipe for language acquisition right there.
And
I love that you have to shake it.
you can put it in a microwave too.
Oh gosh, she makes it worse.
No. It's like popcorn. No.
Oh,
There were just levels to taking it. Kamila.
We know that from these from most of the studies that have been conducted on language acquisition that have been done mostly in the US and in Western Europe, for its majority, that the way that we have studied is that we record parents or we ask parents what do they talk or how do they talk to children. And we have majorly sampled the mothers for this process. And we have found that there are some correlations that seem to suggest that you speak more to your child, then your child seems to do better in certain aspects of language, namely vocabulary. So, and there are some correlations too that suggest that more varied language you expose to your child, then they're more of a varied vocabulary they will have at a given age, if you compare at the same age, right? Which all of this seems pretty sound. It's like, okay, you basically you're learning a little bit what you're hearing. Then the amount, so yes, parents should and can talk to their babies. That's definitely...
And shake them. Possibly.
No, yeah, actually don't shake the baby. That's a public policy that's been very useful across the world. Don't shake babies. Don't shake babies. Don't put them in microwaves.
no popcorn.
No popcorn.
Don't keep them popcorn.
Yeah,
That's a joking hazard.
We're getting some good parenting advice on the episode. A very unique episode, I would say.
Great. Okay. So definitely there is, in the way that we have studied it, it's very similar. It's very bounded to what we consider a family, who we consider to be a very important caregiver. From this standpoint, the mother, especially, has been very, very important for language acquisition studies. And more often than not, it's been the only person who has been invited to study the acquisition of child language. We have colleagues who have, weirdly enough, invited dads, and they seem to do something too. So, shocking, right? No. But it's in the sense that kind of we come back very often in the ways that we have studied things tend to set the margins of what we know.
Right.
And many, many times, if you don't kind of know the history of a field and how you come about to know where you are and what we know, you might miss that you think, oh, then ergo moms are the most important input that children should learn from.
Right.
That's not necessarily false, but it might not be the entire picture.
Right.
So
maybe we can render this more concrete. You want to tell them a little bit about your fieldwork experience and the visits you've done to the Chimane?
Yes.
I'm sorry, I'm like stealing your job.
No worries. We're really happy for you to take over.
So
you could do the next episode as well, for all I know. But yeah, Kamila, on your fieldwork.
follow us, Alexandr.
You know,
No, kidding.
a bilingual podcast. Sorry.
So one of the things that we do in the lab here in Paris is to try to record the early language experiences of children outside of the lab. And one of the ways that we do this is that we go and we put children in diverse places, that this could be as diverse as the Amazonian rainforest to a Vanuatuan island. So really trying to sample diversity of human experiences as varied as you can imagine. and record these early linguistic experiences of children. We do this by putting children a little vest that is custom sized. It's nice. And you slide a little recorder on them and you let it on all day. And that's what is called naturalistic day-long recording. Day-long because it spans for a large amount of hours. And naturalistic is because I'm going to skip the part in which you, of course, tell everyone that someone is being recorded, which is a very, very important thing to make sure that everyone knows about. But then that the child is being recorded, and then every vocalization, every sound that the child produces, it's now being recorded, and also the people that he or she is interacting with during this day is also being recorded. And then we can draw some correlations and analysis from what is and kind of bootstrap to what was actually happening, and how this production of the child and the surrounding might be related. And doing this from various languages. So not only the Indo-European tradition has dominated the field for so long, but now from a bunch of different languages and also different cultures in which the child might be socialized in a different way. So what Alex was kind of saying about this is that I have a long-standing collaboration with a community in Bolivia, in the rainforest of the Amazonian, that's called the Chimane. Where for my PhD project, I went there and I recorded children's early linguistic experiences using this device that I just mentioned. And I came there with I want to say that what I have learned so far, which is like, okay, parents, as you were asking me, parents, how are they contributing to this, to the acquisition of language in Chimane, and a prior language that Alec had published using anthropological behavioral observations. So not audio, but observations. Okay, so written down. They estimated that actually parents were not talking that much to children.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And that was a very interesting insight. It's like, okay, so what does that mean? What are they doing then? And are these children talking? When are they talking? At what is their developmental trajectory similar in any way to what we see? Because we have put so much weight into what input from caregivers, specifically the parents, specifically the mother, has been so long. It's like, what does it look like then?
Right.
And when I arrived there, it was pretty obvious that in the way that we were asking the question was not necessarily applicable, because this is a population that the total fertility is pretty high. So there's a lot of children per family, per cluster of family, I want to say.
I think the average
9.
Yeah,
total fertility
number of kids that one woman has in their so you guys are nodding your heads. Just imagine birthing 9 kids. Okay.
So that's a total fertility. So that's alive children. So total
birth.
So that's an average. So it's it's pretty high. So that means that there is a lot of children though.
Right.
So every there's a lot of other people also that are there. And what I saw is that, okay, I give the recording to a 3-year-old, and then he went off with all his pals that are between 2 to 8 years old in a cascading age of children of different, and they're all cousins, brothers, siblings, sisters. I mean, like a mixed match of children that are going off. And where were the adults here? It's like, well, they're working. They have to feed 9 children or different people, but also they are working because this is a subsistence type of community. So that means that they're not integrated to the market cash economy. But that means that how do they get food then? That means that they grow it, they hunt it, they fish for it, which creates other types of needs and skills and how you spend your day, basically. It's substantially different.
But then this doesn't affect their language acquisition timelines?
It doesn't seem that way.
And then is it the case that they're learning more from their peers than
That's an intuition that we are currently assessing more. So we have data that suggests that basically what we could do at the very first analysis of this data is to see, okay, who talks to the child and when. I mean,
Right.
So you can decode that and say like, okay, the overall proportion of input that these children are hearing is actually a lot from other children, from peers. And this only increases during development, whereas the maternal voice seems to decrease. So it tends to be really high at the beginning, especially that the child is in a sling next to the mom while they're breastfeeding, which makes sense that then the voice of the mother is quite high. But then the moment that weaning happens is when you stop breastfeeding and you're also more, you're able to run away, basically. More often than not, then you're going with the gang of children.
Right. So we've been talking about differences, but are there any cross-cultural regularities that you observe despite studying these diverse populations in language acquisition?
Yes. I think that there are way more similarities than differences.
Okay.
It's just that it's so much easier to spot differences than similarities. Kind of what I was saying at the beginning. It's so much hard to imagine studying language. And then one day you're like, oh, yeah. And then you see it everywhere then. It's like, oh, my God. Language is everywhere. These differences are so obvious these similarities are so obvious that sometimes you neglect them, you know?
And could you maybe give a few quick examples of what those cross-cultural similarities are?
Yeah, so we see things we see, for instance, very similar timelines of emergence of certain milestones. So, for instance, it's usually the case that kids will produce their first meaningful words between like 9 and 14 months of age. So if you're learning a sign language, you might actually sign your first sign recognizable by people and stable at 9 months. If you're learning a spoken language, it will be at 12 months on average. We also see similarities in timeline of babbling. So earlier,
what is babbling?
Babbling is when you produce a sequence of sounds that doesn't make any sense, like ba ba ba, or you do the same with gestures. So signing babies will babble with their hands. When you start combining words together into complex sentences, that also happens on a timeline. So on average, is by 2 years of age, your average length of a sentence is 2, which is useful. And we see that's an example where comparisons to other non-human animals is useful. So we've tried to teach apes how to combine signs, and their average mean length of utterance stays at 1.2 always, regardless of age. And so these are some similarities. Yeah. With language differences. So for instance, we have a colleague who works on an extremely complicated language, which is called Chintang. And those kids, their first words have like 14 different affixes. Whereas English-speaking 1-year-olds will drop all the affixes they can. But there you go. That's, as Camila said, a salient difference because we're very surprised.
And purportedly, one could say that the aim of psychology or cognitive science is maybe to actually find these similarities between all humans because we're studying the mind independently from cultural differences. And there's some areas of psychology that do study these differences. Yes. And you mentioned similarities across cultures. At the same time, one of the themes that's been going through this episode has been the fact that we're now diversifying the populations we study. And so this calls back to a kind of trendy concept in psychology and maybe other domains called weird populations. And we can talk about weird languages as well, maybe. So can you first say what weird populations are? And then maybe we can ask the question of, have we overgeneralized from these kinds of populations?
So weird stands for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And these are adjectives basically to describe these people that I've mentioned before, that are the ones who in general have come to the labs and to the medical facilities and have been kind enough to participate in science and build together what we know so far for science. So these people have been a tendency to fulfill all these 4 or 5 adjectives. So that's what weird stands for. Now, what is the subpart of the question? How we have generalized?
Yeah, have we overgeneralized from these populations?
To some extent. To some extent, we have. I want to say that we have oversampled this population. And then a really interesting question is like, yeah, as you were saying, is this an overgeneralization of the cognitive feats that we are encountering? On the one hand, now that we are starting, I want to say, because I want to believe that it's just the beginning of sampling more diversity into what human cognition looks like, at least for developmental psychology. As Alex was saying, despite input differences, despite cultural differences, despite language, typological differences, we're finding things that are tremendously interesting. Is that, yes, the first word of children across the board seem to be around the first years of life. That the babbling seems to follow the same trajectory across the board. But this also extends to motor development. Walking has been an interesting one, actually. But and then you wanna?
Yeah, maybe I want to jump in.
Yes,
I think that the way that I represent it is that why is it a problem to oversample from this population? Because it's so homogeneous, right? And so now we believe that there are things that are universal that might not be. But there's another problem that people don't necessarily think about, which is that the questions we ask are also homogeneous because we are homogeneous. Well, this room actually happens to be quite, I think we're
diverse,
from 3 different continents, right?
Probably.
Okay, there you go. Well, that's unusual. But so I think the problem we have is that the kinds of questions we've asked and the way we've asked these questions is also biased by the fact that we are from this majority and that we're trained in these majority settings, right? So even though I'm from Argentina and Camila is from Chile, we were both schooled in a setting that, there is a signature of this. And so some of the questions we ask might not be the same questions that other people ask.
And what are some examples of questions that would deviate from?
I think the example of monolingualism, it's one that was very striking, which this oversampling meant to believe that monolingualism was the rule and it's kind of the default, right? By studying more diverse populations and different experiences that are related to language acquisition, now thoughts are starting to change.
Yeah,
I'll give you a precise example. People started studying monolinguals, and they thought that meant that you were born with the assumption that each word has a single meaning and every meaning is expressed by a word. That's not even true in a single language, but never mind. That's what they thought at the beginning. And so then they were like, oh, that's weird. How do bilinguals do this? Because there's a principle which they suppose was a general principle that we were born with, which is called mutual exclusivity. So I give you 2 objects you don't know. I tell you this one is a wug, and now I tell you look at the T-burrow. You're going to look at the other one. Very good job. You're like passing all my tests. You're a great baby.
Thanks for that compliment.
Yeah, and so that's mutual exclusivity. That they thought this was an inborn principle that we all had. And so the question should have been asked backwards. How come monolinguals come to believe that there's mutual exclusivity, that each
Yep,
word is
yep.
representing one concept and each concept is represented by a single word.
Mm.
So we're just like asking the question wrong sometimes.
Right. So another theme that we have been sort of alluding throughout the conversation is that, like we should be studying diverse populations. That seems to be the obvious solution to this over-reliance on English speakers and weird cultures problem. But then, as a scientist, it might also be the case that not every scientist in linguistics and developmental psychology has the resources to diversify their samples. So what do you think are some very feasible solutions for this on the ground, for diversifying the populations that linguists study?
I'm so glad you asked that question because we've thought about that a lot. And so we think that the first thing that we need to do to diversify the sample is diversify the scientist sample. So that can be done in a bunch of different ways. We already have some mechanisms for that when people get grants to go study somewhere else. So I mentioned that in Argentina, if I wanted to do psycholinguistics at that time, I couldn't. Now people can, but at the time I couldn't. Well, we have a new president, so at the time people cannot anymore. Yeah. Moment of silence for my country. But one of the things that we've started to try to do is enable more people in different places to do this. And so we've done this in a few ways. With a colleague in Argentina, we created a podcast that's in Spanish for those of you who do
So
speak.
that explains why you're trying to hijack ours.
Exactly. Yeah, you got me. Yeah, so we had this podcast where we interviewed scientists who work on cognitive science in Latin America, and we asked them this question, why is it that people don't publish more in mainstream avenues? And we got lots of good answers, including English is very hard.
Oh, interesting.
So that was one way, like bringing more attention to more diverse
And
scientists.
sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
What is the name of the podcast if our listeners want to check that out?
It's called Conciencia. With science, yeah, and also consciousness, yeah. I'll share the link with you. And then the other thing we did was we have a few consortia. So these are basically mailing lists, but we try to do things. So a few years ago, in 2021, we did the first truly international language acquisition winter summer school. So this was over a week. We gave lots of lectures and lots of practicals, and we admitted people. We had almost 1,000 registrants from something like 70 different countries, and finally admitted 300 to the online, live portion. So, and we balanced it so that 80% of them came from the global south. And so that's another example. And right now we're creating a mentorship program. So we're trying to find ways to stimulate, connect. We feel like a lot of the reason why there are not more diverse scientists that are present in the mainstream area is in part maybe due to finance, but I think not only. There are things we can actually do. Well, some of them are very simple, like giving them more access, giving them more airtime, more access to ideas, for instance, conferences when they're done on site. When conferences are done on site, that means that only people who can get there can benefit from that. When we make conference hybrid, that's another way in which we can share. And there's, more and more and more that we can do.
Super cool initiative. Since we are almost approaching time, maybe now might be a good time to shift gears and talk about some implications. And so since we've already given a lot of really bad parenting advice, it does seem to be the case that parents are worried about their child's speech production and more precisely the amount of speech that their young ones produce on a daily basis. So for these worried parents out there, and since you've also done some research on this, what have you found to be the best predictors of everyday language production? And is it really a good predictor of, let's say, developmental disorders?
It is the case that early language today is our best predictor both of later language and communicative disorders and also of academic achievement. And so we're definitely not poo-pooing that research. We think that we understand parents that are concerned. And I think that the top thing is if you're concerned, you have to talk to someone. It's unusual for parents to be concerned. So if you have any concern whatsoever, it's a good idea to talk to your doctor, your your family doctor. If you're in France, if you're hearing this and you're in France, the system of PMI is fantastic. They have lots of resources, and so if you have any concern, it's better to insist and say, I have some concerns. Because the worst that can happen is that you're just a little bit worried and your child will end up talking at the same timeline and there won't be a problem. But if you can advocate for them, they are more likely to get early diagnosis, early intervention, and they will have better outcomes.
And so what are some of the, because you mentioned some language disorders, what are some of the, could you sort of list some of these disorders down for the audience?
Yeah, definitely. So there is a variety of disorders. Some of them are very rare, like genetic disorders. Some of them are rare and they're very hard to spot, like Angelman's and Fragile X. So these are rare disorders, which typically often shows through a regression. So a child will babble normally, and then after 1 year of age, they will speak less and less. And so they're so rare that it's unlikely to happen to you. But if you see that in your child, that's definitely a sign that you should seek medical intervention. Then there are more widespread conditions which are more communicative. For instance, autism disorder. There's today no clear test for diagnosis of autism before 3 years of age, but it's still a good idea to talk to your doctor. So if you see, for instance, that your child cannot keep your eye gaze, if you see that their sensory profile is unusual, for instance, they're very reactive to loud sounds, or on the contrary, they're really seeking loud sounds and they're making a lot of loud sounds, which is, I know, very common. But if you notice lots of these sensory profiles that seem different, for instance, another example is a child who throws themselves into snow because they love that feeling, or on the contrary, they refuse to wear some clothes because it seems like they're itchy or something like that. So these are all signs that you might want to look into at least an autism diagnosis or some kind of sensory diagnosis.
Should we wrap up?
Yeah. So before we end, this is something that we usually do. Would you like to follow up or clarify some of your responses to some of the questions that we asked? Or if there's anything we missed and you thought we should have really talked about this, now's the time to maybe flag those things.
I think I do want to say I mentioned the correlation with academic achievement, and I wanted to say that we are often called upon as experts in this because of the hope that we can make babies talk more and therefore have them do better at school. And we want to acknowledge the fact that there's some research aligned with this idea, but we also feel like it's really preliminary to decide that now the government should institute that families should talk more to their kids. It might be a little bit early to make that conclusion. But yeah, if some listeners are interested in that, this is something that actively we discuss all the time in our team, and I think we'd be happy to follow up on.
Cool. And so where can our listeners go from here? And do you have any recommendation for a book or any other piece of media about the topics we discussed? It doesn't have to be academic. It can be, for example, a film that illustrates some of the points.
We, in the lab and along with a quite diverse set of researchers, we put together a developmental blog that acts on language acquisition. And for parents that might have doubts or have specific questions, we cover a wide range of topics from bilingualism, screen time, developmental disorders, and it's fully done by researchers. It's the comic-based blog in which you have a little comic strip, and then we have an explanation of how can I foster my baby's reading skills, or this also includes a lot of signing blog posts for...
And what is this blog called?
It's called kotobu.org.
Again,
We'll link.
pin it in the description.
100% fact-check, evidence-based.
So nice.
Everything is based on... We do 100% of the research of finding this research and make it comprehensible for parents.
Well,
And it's multilingual.
great.
Yes, it's in 8 different languages.
Oh,
Awesome. Awesome. So
You've been listening to Cognitations, a bilingual podcast about parenting. We've been chatting with Alex Christia and Camilla Scaff. Thank you so much.
on the next episode of Cognitations, we'll chat with Pierre Jacot about the history and foundations of cognitive science. If you've ever wondered about how the field of cognitive science came into incipience, this episode is not to be missed.